Dear students, today we'll discuss another essay from your women's writing paper, and the essay is titled From Experience to Aesthetics, the Dialectics of Language and Representation, and it is by Jasbir Jain. Even this essay is taken from her collection Growing Up as a Woman Writer. That was a book which was published in 2006. So this essay is part of that collection. Now first let's look at the author, Jasbir Jain. She is an Indian author born in 1937, and she is presently the Honorary Director of the Institute for Research in Interdisciplinary Studies, Jaipur. She has received many awards and fellowships like Sahitya Academy Fellowship as Writer in Residence, then UGC Fellowship, Emeritus Fellowship, KK Birla Fellowship for Comparative Literature, and she has been the elected member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. She has secured the Fulbright Fellowship of the American Council of Learned Societies. The American Association of Colleges and Universities nominated her as a Global Fellow for 2003. In 2004, she was awarded the Indian Association of Canadian Studies Award in recognition of her outstanding contribution to Canadian studies, and in 2008, the South Asia Literary Association also conferred on her the award for her work in feminist and South Asian studies. So these are just things that you need to know, that's all. There's nothing that you have to by heart. It is just that you keep in mind that she is a great renowned scholar. So these are some of the important books that she has authored: Theorizing Resistance, Narratives in History and Politics, Indigenous Roots of Feminism, Culture, Subjectivity and Agency, and Beyond Postcolonialism, Dreams and Realities of a Nation, and Growing Up as a Woman Writer, published in 2006. This is the book that I mentioned, and this is the book from which the essay prescribed for you is taken. And in 2003, she published another book, Gendered Realities, Human Spaces. Now, when you look at her works, you see that her major interest areas are critical theory and feminist and cultural issues. Now, just like Gayatri Spivak, she is one of the prominent voices not only of Indian feminist writing but feminist writing across the globe. And presently, she is engaged in research on the indigenous roots of feminism. So that's about the author Jasbir Jain. Now I have just consolidated the whole of this essay into 6 or 7 points. Okay, so that it will be easy for you to learn and understand. Now we'll discuss each point. Jasbir Jain begins the essay by talking about the importance of language and representation in literature. We all know that both these entities, language and representation, are the central aspects of literature. For literature to come into existence, you need some language, right? You need a medium to communicate the idea. The author needs a medium to communicate. The language can be any language, but still you need a language to communicate your ideas. And by representation, we mean that all literatures, all forms of literatures, all types of literatures, all genres of literatures, or literatures belonging to any culture, so all these literatures will be representing some idea, some culture, some feeling, some ideology, right? So there will be something that will be represented through literature. So Jasbir Jain begins the essay by talking about these two entities, language and representation. And she says that there is a connective link between language and representation. Sometimes we may feel that this connection between language and representation is very simple. But in reality, according to Jain, it is a complicated process. The relation between language and representation is a complicated process according to Jasbir Jain. She says it is problematic. Okay, now let's see why does she say so. See, language is something which has always controlled the human mind. Language has controlled the human mind. It has controlled our memory. It has controlled our being, etc. Even when we think, language is a process or language is in action. Even when we dream, language is in action. So, for our existence or in our being, language is very much a central force. Not only that, language is very powerful as well. According to Jain, language has the power to transform cultures as well. See, for example, you take the example of colonization. In processes like colonization or migration, language has a very important role. For example, let's take the case of India. We had a pre-colonial culture, we had a pre-colonial language, everything. But it was then that the Britishers came, they colonized us, they introduced their culture, language, everything. So the language that we use now and the language that we used before colonization is entirely different. Now, this colonization has not only happened in terms of physical, or it is not only the physical colonization that has happened, but it has also brought forth the psychological colonization. And with this psychological colonization, our language is also affected. Our culture is also affected. All our thought process will also undergo some form of transformation. Okay, so when such processes like colonization or migration happens, this will affect our language, and in turn it will also affect the way we perceive things, we represent things. You take the writings of authors who wrote before colonization and the authors who write now, presently or after colonization. Their ideologies will be different. Their language will be different. Their thought processes will be different. There will be cultural, social, political, ideological changes that are happening. So all these changes will affect language and also the way we represent our culture, our ideas, etc. Okay, so that is why Jasbir Jain says that this is not a simple connection that is running between language and representation. Whatever changes happen in the background, that will affect the language and that will also affect the way we represent our ideologies. Okay, so that is her point. And then she also adds that it is not only the social, the cultural, historical or political changes that affect language and representation, but there is also the intervention of gender. Okay, there is also the intervention of gender. When gender politics is at work, that change will also be reflected in language and representation. See, earlier, a few centuries ago, that women writers did not have the space to express their thoughts or write books or other works. So we were reading books by male authors. So it was the male author's ideology or his perceptions that were expressed through these works. But by the 20th century, you know about the different waves of feminism and how women started exercising their power, or how women started demanding a space for themselves, how women started expressing their feelings and thoughts which were long silenced. Okay, so with the intervention of gender, there has been a change happening in language and representation. So this is the first point that Jasbir Jain talks about. She talks about language and representation and how is it connected and how is it a problematic connection and what is the reason behind that problem and how the different changes, the socio-cultural, political, historical and gender changes have affected language and representation. So that is your first point. Next, Jasbir Jain talks about the language or the significance of language in women's writing. Okay, so she says that feminist theorists have understood the significance of language. Feminist theorists have understood the significance of language because when you look at women's writing, the language employed by a woman writer is of course different from a male writer. Now, since ages, we have been perceiving everything from the language or from the point of view of a male writer. Even women were made to know what it is to be a female through the writings of a male. So that was the trend that was there since ages. So when women started writing, the language that they used, it helped to create a world of their own that was different from the world that the male author created for the female. Okay, so the women writers, what did they do? In the context of women's writing, they can freely and frankly delineate, talk about their experiences, okay, the values that they hold for, all the ideas that is there in their minds. So with the coming of women's writing, women were no longer forced to adapt and assimilate the standards put forth by the male. So with the coming of women's writing, women started declaring for themselves that this is what it means to be a woman. This is how we experience things. This is how we felt about the world. Okay, so this kind of frank expression was not there during the early times when men took hold of the literary world. So here Jasbir Jain gives the example of a Canadian environmental activist and eco-feminist named Zipporah Berman. Zipporah Berman has written an essay titled The Rape of Mother Nature. The Rape of Mother Nature. Now, in this work, she has said that dominant language denies the experience of minorities and it reinforces class and race oppression. That's what she said in the essay. That means this is something that operates in all cultures. It is not only in terms of language, but in terms of everything around us. It is always the dominant ideology that is held powerful. Okay? For example, the thoughts and beliefs of the upper classes, the manners and customs of the upper classes. Okay? And the ideas like man is superior and woman is inferior, or the idea like black is inferior and white is superior. So who said all this? It is the dominant classes, it is the dominant sections of society. It is they who catered such ideas. Okay? And they suppressed the minorities. The thoughts, feelings, language, customs, manners, etc. of the minorities were suppressed, were overlooked. The upper classes are interested in oppression, in any form of oppression, be it class, based on class, be it based on skin color, be it based on gender, whatever. They are interested in oppression. So this is what Zipporah Berman says, that even in terms of language, this sort of authority or superiority is always claimed by the dominant sections of society. They always deny space for the experience of minorities. That's true, because when you check the history of literature, you see that it is only during the end of the 19th century or 20th century that we hear the voices of marginalized sections like women, blacks, dalits, other marginalized communities. They started writing, they started expressing, or they started telling, blurting out the stories of oppression that they had to suffer for long. So it is just a recent phenomenon. So since ages, what has been happening is that the dominant sections, they just reinforce their ideology. So Jasbir Jain says that trend has to end. And especially in the context of women's writing, women writers have to move away from that trend formulated by the dominant sections. And they have to develop a language of their own to deal with the female experience, because that is something which nobody has heard until now. So now the woman author, she has to develop a language of her own to talk about her authentic, her real experiences. Okay, so this is your second point, language, or the significance of language in women's writing according to Jasbir Jain. Okay, she talks about how language has been silenced, especially in terms of women's writing, how the language of women and other minorities have been silenced, and how now it starts, we hear the voices of those who were silenced since ages. So that is your second point. Moving on to the third point. Now, after asking the women writers to develop a language for their own, next, Jasbir Jain is telling us about the problems that may be faced by women writers especially, or writers in general. So she says that, according to Jain, a writer is a mediator, okay? A middleman or a middle person. It's a mediator. And he or she has to cross several boundaries. Okay? So she says that a writer is a mediator who has to cross several boundaries. Now, one of the first boundary or one of the first problems that she puts forth is the limits of the self. It's the limits of the self. Now, for that, she takes examples from interviews by many women writers. Interviews with many women writers, which is collected in a book named Storylines, edited by Ammu Joseph. It is a book published in 2003, which contains interviews with many women writers. Now, in all the interviews, almost every writer mentions the impact of censorship. Now, censorship is something which limits the ideas that people are allowed to express. And we see that sometimes this authority called censorship, it prohibits sometimes books, films, news that are considered obscene or politically unacceptable or some threat to the public. So here also, in that interviews with women writers, they all mention the impact of censorship. And this censorship can be sometimes imposed by the self, or it can be by the family, or it can be by the society. So the censorship may be by self, by family, or society. Sometimes if you feel like writing very explicitly some idea, but you yourself try to cover it up, or you feel like you have an inhibition to write so explicitly, something is pulling you back, yourself is pulling you back. Sometimes it can be the author's family. They will say that no, you should not write it in such a plain way, that's not fine. So you can sometimes get pressures from the family that you should not express it so explicitly like that. Sometimes it can be the society as a whole. You will have an inhibition, you will have a fear to express something because the society might not take it in that sense. That will be misjudged, and it can lead to so many other discussions and problems. So the censorship might be any one of these. And Jasbir Jain says that there are several subjects like sex, which one feels inhibited to write, especially in one's own language. And it is at such a point that translation or English can come to the help. Because when you adopt a foreign language, it distances you from your mother, and you feel much freer. Your tongue is free from her moral reasoning. Okay, sometimes we may not utter some words or phrases in our own language, but you will express it in a more euphemistic way in another language, especially in English language. Okay, so this method can be adopted by writers when it comes to censorship. If you feel inhibited to write in your own language, you can write it in English language, because your tongue will be more free and free from moral reasoning. And here Jasbir Jain gives us the example of several Indian writers, women writers, who had altered their styles, or who have stopped writing, or who have stopped using that explicit style because of this censorship issues. One is Rukmini Bhaya Nair. Now, Rukmini Bhaya Nair, she's an Indian poet and was very much noted for her trenchant criticism of Hindutva ideology and religious and caste discrimination that it promotes. But she was vehemently criticized for many of her works. And just like that, Anamika, also another Hindi poet, both these writers had to alter their style of writing due to censorship issues. First, they spoke very explicitly, but they had this problem of censorship issues. Their poems were sometimes banned, heavily criticized, and so in order to continue with the writing tradition, they had to alter or make compromise with their writings. Okay, another prominent writer is Mridula Garg. She is also an Indian writer who writes in Hindi and English languages. She has published many books, like 30 books in Hindi, consisting of plays, novels, short stories, etc. And she has also secured the Sahitya Academy Award. Now, she has published a novel named Chitta Cobra in 1979, and she was arrested for obscenity. For presenting very explicit scenes in her novel, and she had to fight a legal battle for 2 years in the name of such explicit writings. So after all this, we see that Mridula Garg slowly withdrew into a long silence because of all the legal and other issues that she had to face because of her style of writing. Another writer is Krishna Sobti. She is also a Sahitya Academy Award winner and an Indian Hindi language fictioneer and essayist. She also had to endure tremendous criticism for the language and sexuality that she expressed in her work Mitro Marjani, and that was a novel which was published in 1966, and it is set in rural Punjab, and it talks about a young married woman and her exploration of sexuality. Anyway, the book was translated into English by Geeta Rajan. It was called To Hell With You, Mitro, and that propelled Sobti to fame. So this is the third point of our essay, the problems faced by women writers, and particularly one of the first problem that Jasbir Jain talks about is the limits of the self, the censorship issue, which can be due to self-imposed or family-imposed or society-imposed. And she takes examples from the many Indian authors who had to alter their writing style, or who had to silence themselves due to this explicit writing style. Okay. Now, the next problem that Jasbir Jain talks about is the problem of translation. So here she says that in the case of a translated work, there are two mediators. You have the writer, as I already told. According to Jasbir Jain, the writer is a mediator. So in the case of a translated work, you also have the translator as the mediator. So there are two mediators, the writer as well as the translator. Okay? And then she points out that Indian writing, in the context of Indian writing, translation is a problem. Now this is something which has been pointed out by authors like Salman Rushdie and Shashi Deshpande. They have said that translation is an issue in Indian writing in English. Now what is the reason? Because when you translate, we have so many regional languages in India. Okay, so when a work originally in a regional language is translated into English, in some cases at least, the true essence will be lost. Because some words and phrases that we use in our regional language will be irreplaceable or will be untranslatable. So what will a translator normally do? He will find a phrase or a word in English which comes near to the meaning of that original word in the original language. But then again, the true essence will be lost when it gets translated. The real idea will not be translated, will not be there in the translated version. So she gives the example of the writer Krishna Sobdi, because she is a writer known for using new writing styles, because she uses idiomatic Punjabi, Urdu and sometimes Rajasthani as well. So this intermingling of Urdu, Punjabi and Hindi cultures, that sort of language is very difficult for a translator to translate it into English. So because of this unique writing style, she has created a different language register for her own novels. So this is one problem that Indian writers face in terms of translation. But then again, Jasbir Jain says that translation is also important because it enhances readership and also it reaches out to readers outside our culture. See, within the context of India, many of the readers may not be able to read Hindi works or Tamil works or works written in Telugu or other regional languages. There are so many literatures produced in regional sites as well. So because we don't know all these languages, we cannot read their works as well. So when it gets translated, the readership will increase. Not only that, it reaches out to readers outside our culture. Even when it is translated to a foreign language like English, people belonging to other countries, they will also start reading our works and they get to know about our cultures, customs, etc. Okay, so this is the quality, or this is something, the good side of translation. But in the end, Jasbir Jain notes that many times in the process of translation, meanings get transferred. That means the meaning of a word, the equivalent of that word can be found in English, but the constituent levels and implications are left behind. That is what we mean by the essence. That will be many times left behind. You can get the semantic equivalent of that work or the translated version of that work, but the essence will always be left behind. Okay, so this is what Jasbir Jain talks about the problems of translation. That is your fourth point. In the next point, she talks about the problems faced by Dalit and tribal writers especially. Now, what's the problem with Dalit and tribal writers? See, when a Dalit writer or a tribal writer, when they write about their thoughts and experiences, they often take words and phrases from their dialects or from their spoken languages. This will not be digested by the upper class reader. They will not accept it. Sometimes it upsets the expectations of the upper class reader. When you read works by Om Prakash Valmiki or by Bhama or by Limbale, you can see that they adopt words or they take words from their mother tongue. So this is at times unacceptable to the upper class reader. And here Jain gives us the example of Bhama. Bhama is a Dalit writer. She is the author of Sangati. And she has once stated that the literary critics, they have commented on her language as vulgar and obscene. The literary critics called her language, her writing style as vulgar and obscene. But what happened? She accepted that criticism. And she says that criticism only strengthened me. It convinced me more to affirm that it was my language. It was our language, the language of my community. What's the problem in me adopting words from taking words from my own language? And she argued that if these critics can accept all other foreign and regional languages, then why not us? Then why not our dialects? Okay, so she was so strong in asserting that this is my way of expression, this is our way of expression. And what came to me naturally, I retained as my language, my own. Okay, so she was very strongly asserting that this is my language. This is something which is part and parcel of me. So when I write a book about my experiences, I will also adopt or use my language to express my experiences. What's the problem in that? So that was her response to the critics who commented on her language as vulgar and obscene. Now this is a problem faced by the Dalit and tribal writers according to Jasbir Jain. Next, point number 6. She brings forth the concept of writing for oneself and writing for the other. That means you can talk about your experiences, your feelings, or your community, your society, your country, etc. You can also talk for somebody else. You can be their voice, somebody who has been marginalized, somebody who has been silenced. You can be their spokesperson, or you can be a person who empathize with their sufferings and feelings, and you blurt it out to the world. So this is what she means by writing for oneself and writing for the other. And according to Jain, language and representation can be differently motivated when one writes for oneself and when one writes for the other. These are two different things. Okay, and to explain that, She considers the writings by non-Dalit writers about Dalits and the writings by Dalit writers about their own community. Okay, she considers the writings by non-Dalit writers about Dalits and the writings by Dalits about their own community. To elaborate this, she cites the example of two authors. One is Mahashweta Devi. She's a non-Dalit, but she has always voiced for the experiences and sufferings of the Dalits and tribals. She has mapped the experiences of Dalits and tribals in many of her works. Another writer that Jasbir Jain gives the example is that of Bhama. We have already referred to her, Bhama. So first let's look at Mahashweta Devi. Now here Jain talks about one of her collection, imaginary maps. In that she has given voice to the experiences of the tribals or the Dalit communities who had to suffer in the hands of the upper class. And when asked about her association with the tribals and Dalits, she had stated that I started living with them and I had tried to solve their problems by seeing everything from his or her point of view. So she has tried to empathize with them, tried to identify their problems as her own, and that's how she charted out solutions, or that's how she voiced their sufferings through her works. And here Jain cites the examples of two works by Mahashweta Devi. One is a story named The Witch, and the other is a play named Bayan. Now in both these stories, the social phenomenon of witch making is discussed. In the story The Witch, we see a tribal priest's daughter. She was raped. She is a dumb girl, and she is raped by the upper class Thakur. And then she is driven to the forest as he announces that a witch possessed her. Okay, it is the upper class Thakur who raped her, who molested her, and after that what did he do? He told that she is possessed and that she should be driven away from the village because she might become a threat to the whole village. So the villagers they also joined the Thakur and they stoned her away. She is driven away from the village to the forest. Now after all that fear, all that night-long vigilance, that singing and drum beating and all that process, it is only in the end that the villagers realize that it is one among them who had been exploited. The girl, she is their tribal priest's daughter. She is one among them. And the upper class Thakur has managed to exploit her. This realization comes only in the end. Okay. Another example is a play by Mahashweta Devi named Bayan. In that we meet a character named Chandi. And Chandi is called a witch because she does the masculine job of cremating the dead that is not expected from a woman. So she is called a witch because she deals with the dead. But then due to a catastrophe, she has to bury several bodies of infants. Okay, several bodies of infants. And this arouses the maternal feelings in her. So, this story deals with that emotional conflict between livelihood and motherhood. And this is why she is called Bayan. Bayan means an unnatural woman. Okay, so in these two works, Jasbir Jain says that Mahashweta Devi, in these two works, she has crossed over from a mere observer to a participant. Along with these characters, Mahashweta Devi is also feeling that pain. She is participant in that suffering process. Okay. Next, she talks about Bama. Bama is a Dalit writer. She also discusses this witch-making process in Sankati. Okay, but in that, it is from the point of view of gender discrimination. In case of Mahashweta Devi, it is not only gender discrimination, but it is also racial, class discrimination. Fine, class, caste discrimination. Okay, so in Bama, it is gender discrimination that is the focal point. And it is the realization that it is always the women, the meek and unprotected, who are called witches. The men or the upper class men are behind all this. But in the end, the victim is after all women. So what Jasbir Jain is trying to communicate is that here the non-Dalit Mahashweta Devi, she is writing for the other. She is writing on behalf of the Dalits. And when she writes on behalf of the Dalits, or when she writes for the other, she is read by people elsewhere, everywhere. Fine. Her readership is much vast. Even the non-Dalits read this work. On the other hand, Bama's voice will be heard aloud in her village. It will be the Dalits who will be more interested in Bama's work because it is one among themselves. It is like writing for themselves, or it is like writing for oneself. Okay, so this is her point, writing for oneself and writing for the other. And in the concluding segment, Jasbir Jain says that the process of writing has underwent so many changes. From being a personal or a subjective or an objective act of art, it is now a political act. Political in the sense there is the question of power. Through writing, you have to express your power. You have to find a space for yourself. It has become a very competitive world. Fighting for power. Everywhere we see politics at play. So in the field of writing also, politics is at play. Okay, so when it comes to writing, she says that both the aspects of language as well as representation has to be considered, because both these aspects are very crucial in terms of literature. And especially when you come to women's writing, they have to consciously develop strategies of power because they have to fight for space. They have to find space for self-expression. Okay? And along with self-expression, they also have to help the other to find their voice. All those marginalized sections, all those silenced groups, all those muted voices. So the woman writer, along with self-expression, she also have to give voice to these groups. Fine. And finally, she says that women's writing has to evolve from the margins and it has to flow out to a non-gendered readership and thereby create a new aesthetics. See, the male writing that was there, it was read irrespective of gender. Both the male and the female readers read and enjoyed it. But when it comes to women's writing, the readership is mostly female oriented. So now she says that we have to evolve from the margins and we have to evolve into a non-gendered writing style so that we can cater to that non-gendered readers or to everybody irrespective of male or female and thereby create a new aesthetics. Okay, so this is the end of the essay by Jasbir Jain. So you can also learn it like that. All these 7 points, this is the crux of the essay. Thank you.